Hey guys, this is Morgan Bergstrom and Sarah Puz on hormone regulation of the kidney. So here we have a really basic picture of the kidney, but what's really cool about the kidney is actually what's going on inside and what's making the kidney work, which are the nephrons. And there's about 1 million nephrons in each kidney. And we're going to go over the nephron and each of its little parts pretty quickly, but what's important about the nephron is that the hormones we're going to be discussing directly affect the nephron. And so that's really important to our discussion, knowing how the nephron works in each of its parts. But before we do that, we're going to give you guys 5 fun facts about the kidney. Fun fact number 1 is that the kidneys filter about 200 quarts of blood per day. And to put that into perspective, that's around 95 2-liter bottles, like pop bottles, a day. That's a lot. That's a lot of blood, so that's pretty cool. Another fun fact is that the kidneys will continue to work until they have lost 75 to 80% of their function. So each kidney is about 4.5 inches long, and so that's about the size of a cell phone, so they're actually not too big. And they both weigh around 4 to 6 ounces. Once you reach the age of 40 years old, your nephrons begin to fail by 1%. So our last and final fact is that if you were to take all the nephron tubules from both of the kidneys and laid them out, they would be around 16 kilometers long. So now we're going to be moving on to our different parts of the nephron, a quick recap. And so it starts at the Bowman's capsule and the glomerulus. So there's a blood vessel called the renal artery, which leads to the kidney and branches into arterioles and then tiny capillaries. And the ball of capillaries that kind of sits within the Bowman's capsule is called the glomerulus. And blood is filtered as it passes through the glomerulus, and plasma is forced out of the capillaries and into the Bowman's capsule. And this whole process is called filtration. And filtration is when the blood passes through the glomerulus and into the Bowman's capsule, but only small substances such as ions, water, glucose, urea, and amino acids can pass through the capillary walls. Large substances like proteins and blood cells are too big and they're not able to pass through. So now we're moving on to our second part of the nephron, which is the proximal tubule, also known as the proximal convoluted tubule, since it's kind of squiggly as you can see. And here's where we get reabsorption of important materials that we want in our blood, such as NaCl, K+, glucose, and even some water comes out here. Now going back into the loop are things that we want to get rid of and excrete and put in our urine, such as toxins and drugs. And so those are going to go into the loop and go down the descending loop of Henle. Next we go to the descending loop of Henle. And not too much goes on here except that the walls are permeable only to water, not solutes. So water is going to leave by osmosis. And when that happens, inside there's going to leave a really high concentration of solutes on the inside. And that's going to be important when we move to the ascending loop of Henle. A really easy way to remember that the descending loop is only permeable to water is to kind of think of it like a waterfall. So a waterfall goes down and only water comes out of the descending loop. When we get to the ascending loop of Henle, things kind of switch from the descending loop, and now the walls are not permeable to water, only to solutes. And so all those solutes that we had on the descending loop are now on the ascending loop, but this is where NaCl is transported out actively.
Don't be judging, I know I can say things that are clear, and sometimes backwards, all the way on home I will be near.
Next we have our distal tubule, and a way to remember that the distal tubule is the second tubule is that distal kind of sounds like distance and it actually means far from the beginning, and so of course then it would be the second one. But here the distal tubule, substances that haven't entered the capsule yet enter here from the blood, and this is called secretion. So some substances such as H+, potassium, and ammonia and ions go back into the tubule, and we actually do get a few things that come out, such as calcium and water, but the biggest part is secretion, where things are coming back into the tubule. And the reason these ions are coming in is because we want to get rid of them, and we want to excrete them, and so we don't want them in our blood anymore, and that's why they're coming back into the tubule. So we've made it to the final part of the nephron, which is the collecting duct. And the collecting duct is basically what connects the filtrate that we've been making, which is eventually going to be urine, and it is your urine, to the bladder, and so that's what you're going to excrete and get rid of. A few things also happen here at the collecting duct, and one of the main things that we're going to talk about next is its permeability to water, and that is controlled by one of the hormones we're going to discuss, which is ADH. And so it's really important to understand the collecting duct because that hormone directly affects what goes on here. There's 4 hormones that we're going to be discussing, and those are ADH, aldosterone, calcitonin, and PTH. And we did put ADH versus aldosterone, even though they don't necessarily undo each other, but calcitonin and PTH do. They are called antagonist hormones. While it's not necessarily essential information, it is kind of nice to know that ADH comes from the posterior pituitary gland, aldosterone from the adrenal cortex or gland, you can really say either, calcitonin from the thyroid, and PTH from the parathyroid. Antidiuretic hormone, or shorthand ADH, affects water reabsorption in the collecting duct. So if your fluid intake is really low or you're dehydrated, ADH helps your body retain water by concentrating your urine. So I know, kind of weird to talk about, but when your urine is really, really yellow, that means you're dehydrated, and ADH is hard at work collecting lots of water and reabsorbing lots of water, so less comes out in your urine. However, on the opposite, when your fluid intake is high or you're hydrated, ADH levels will be really low, and so they won't be doing much, and so your urine is going to be a lot clearer and wider because that means you have a lot more water in your collecting duct, and that is getting released. Our next hormone is aldosterone, and this hormone is responsible for regulating sodium reabsorption in the distal convoluted tubule. And so this is really important to understand for someone who, let's say, has hypertension, which is low blood pressure. You want to reabsorb salt, even though it sounds kind of bad, like, oh, I don't want salt in my body, but it's actually really good because that increases blood pressure. Because if there's more salt, then the outside is going to be hypertonic to your blood cells, and so then more water is going to come out and you're going to have a higher blood pressure. And a good example of this is athletes who take Gatorade after they work out. They want to raise their blood pressure so that it can be at a healthy level. Our third hormone, calcitonin, inhibits reabsorption of calcium into the blood. So there's actually going to be less calcium in the blood because the kidneys aren't going to let the blood reabsorb as much. So there's actually going to be more calcium that's excreted. Our fourth and final hormone is PTH, and although PTH is directed at the ascending loop of Henle, where calcitonin was directed at the distal tubule, it still undoes what calcitonin did because it increases reabsorption of calcium into the blood, and so the level of calcium in the blood rises. So that's all, guys. I hope you guys found this helpful, but I think the important thing to remember is that the kidney gets rid of nitrogenous waste, but also reabsorbs water and salts and important materials back into the blood with the help of some of the hormones such as aldosterone, ADH, PTH, calcitonin. Those all help in reabsorption or less reabsorption into the blood.